500 Viet Cong dead. 1 Australian soldier wounded. The Pentagon said it was statistically impossible. You're looking at the numbers wrong. This wasn't combat. This was something the American military couldn't understand, couldn't replicate, and damn sure couldn't accept. The year was 1967, and deep in the jungles of Phuoc Thu province, a handful of Australians were rewriting every rule of warfare the United States believed in. The kill ratios defied physics. 100 to 1. 200 to 1. Some patrols claimed 500 to 1. The American response wasn't admiration. It was denial, then suspicion, then something uglier, professional jealousy that would poison allied relations for decades. You think you know about elite forces in Vietnam? You're wrong. Every documentary shows you the Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, ICVSOG operators vanishing into Laos. Brave men, extraordinary warriors, facing 100% casualty rates in some units. But there was another force operating in those jungles, smaller, quieter, so effective the Viet Cong gave them a name that still echoes in Vietnamese military academies today, Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. Not because they wore special camouflage, not because they carried exotic weapons, because they hunted like ghosts, killed like surgeons, and vanished like smoke. And they did it using methods that contradicted every principle American doctrine held sacred. What happens when the best soldiers on earth discover they're not the best? What happens when your closest ally achieves results you can't explain? Why would Pentagon officials fly 12,000 miles to study foreign tactics and refuse to adopt them? How does professional respect curdle into institutional resentment? Who really controlled the jungle in the First Corps in Phuoc Thu, the Americans with their massive firepower, or the Australians with their silence? Stay until the end, because what happened between U.S. Special Forces and Australian SAS in Vietnam reveals an uncomfortable truth about military culture, national pride, and why the most dangerous enemy isn't always across the battle line. The jungle had rules. The Australians learned them in Malaya. The Americans tried to rewrite them in Vietnam. Only one approach kept men alive. 1966. The Australian SAS arrived in South Vietnam with 120 men. Small numbers for a war consuming 500,000 American troops. The Pentagon barely noticed them initially. Another token allied contribution. Political window pressing for an unpopular war. The Australian government deployed just enough soldiers to maintain the alliance, not enough to matter strategically. Washington calculated divisions and brigades. What difference could 120 men make in a conflict zone the size of New Mexico? The American military machine measured success in body counts and bomb tonnage. Artillery shells fired, sorties flown, bases secured. This was modern warfare industrial, overwhelming, unstoppable. Or so the Doctrine promised. The Australians operated from Nui Dat in Phuoc Thu province, east of Saigon, remote, provincial, away from the main American operations in Corps and the Central Highlands. Good, they preferred it that way. Less supervision, less interference. The Australian approach didn't translate well to PowerPoint presentations at MACV headquarters. It didn't generate impressive statistics for congressional briefings. It just worked. Patrol by patrol, week by week, the numbers started appearing in intelligence reports. Absurd numbers. Impossible ratios. Numbers that made American officers check the paperwork 3 times. Certain there'd been a clerical error. Australian SAS patrol. 6 men, 14 days, 43 enemy killed, 0 friendly casualties. Another patrol. 5 men, 8 days, 62 enemy eliminated. 1 Australian slightly wounded. Then another. And another. The pattern held. Month after month, The Australian kill ratios climbed while their casualty rates plummeted. By late 1967, the accumulated statistics defied everything American military science understood about small unit operations. The official record showed the Australian SAS achieving kill ratios exceeding 100 to 1. Some patrols claimed numbers approaching 500 to 1. The Viet Cong and NVA were competent, experienced jungle fighters. They'd fought the French to a standstill. They were bleeding the American military white. Yet somehow they died in wholesale lots when they encountered Australian patrols. The American response wasn't celebration. It was skepticism. Body count inflation was rampant in Vietnam. Everyone knew it. Ambitious officers padded numbers to please superiors. Civilians counted as combatants. Water buffalo became enemy logistics. Assets neutralized. The Pentagon had learned to discount field reports by 50% as standard practice. So when Australian numbers arrived, showing kill ratios 10 times higher than comparable American units, the initial reaction was predictable. The Aussies were lying. Had to be. Playing the same game everyone else played, just with less shame about the magnitude of the exaggeration. But the intelligence officers tasked with verification found something disturbing. The Australian numbers. Checked out. Weapons captured matched bodies claimed. Enemy documents recovered confirmed casualties. Viet Cong after-action reports, intercepted by signals intelligence, corroborated Australian accounts. In some cases, enemy casualty estimates were higher than Australian claims. And there was something else in those intercepted communications. Something that made American intelligence analysts pause. The Viet Cong were afraid of the Australians, not cautious, not respectful, genuinely afraid. Radio intercepts captured NVA commanders warning subordinates about Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The enemy had given the Australian SAS a title reserved for supernatural threats. American forces received no such distinction. The Viet Cong fought Americans with confidence. They fought Australians with dread. This created a problem for the American military establishment. The numbers were real. The effectiveness is undeniable, which meant the Australian SAS had discovered something, developed some technique or approach that delivered results an order of magnitude better than American special operations. Professional curiosity demanded investigation. National pride demanded an explanation that didn't involve American methods being inferior. By 1967, Pentagon officials decided they needed to see this miracle for themselves. A delegation flew to Australia to observe training methods that were producing astonishing results in Vietnam. What they witnessed contradicted every principle of American military doctrine. The American way of war was firepower. Overwhelming, industrial-scale firepower. When American forces made contact with the enemy, the response was automatic call for artillery, call for air support, call for helicopter gunships. Bring everything. Crush the enemy under tonnage. The U.S. Army calculated it took 50,000 rounds of small arms ammunition to kill one enemy soldier in Vietnam. 50,000 rounds. The solution wasn't better marksmanship. It was more ammunition, more artillery, bigger bombs. The American military had defeated Germany and Japan through material superiority. That's what America did. They outproduce, outspend, overwhelm. It worked in World War II. It would work in Vietnam. The Australian approach was different, profoundly different. Based on experience fighting communist insurgents in the Malayan Emergency and Indonesian confrontation, conflicts Americans barely remembered, if they knew about them at all. The British and Australians had spent 12 years in Malaya learning how to fight guerrillas in jungle terrain. They'd made every mistake possible, bled for every lesson. But they'd won. Actually, one destroyed the communist insurgency completely The techniques developed in Malaya became doctrine. Patience over firepower, stealth over force, intelligence over attrition. The jungle wasn't an obstacle to overcome. It was an environment to inhabit. The enemy didn't need to be crushed. He needed to be hunted. Pentagon observers watched Australian instructors teach tracking. Not land navigation. Tracking. Following footprints days old through jungle that received 300 inches of rain annually. Reading compressed vegetation to determine how many men had passed, how long ago, how heavily laden. Identifying enemy units by the unique tread patterns on their sandals. Ho Chi Minh sandals, cut from tire rubber, each batch displaying different wear characteristics. Australian trackers could distinguish between tracks left by Viet Cong and local farmers, between soldiers moving to combat and soldiers moving away from it, between a confident unit and a demoralized one, all from barely visible disturbances in the jungle floor. The American observers found it remarkable, also impractical. U.S. doctrine didn't include time for tracking. American patrols moved fast, covered ground, and established a presence. The Australian method was slow, painstaking. A 5-man patrol might move 1 kilometer in a full day, sometimes less. They'd spend hours motionless, just watching, listening, letting the jungle accept them. This wasn't reconnaissance, it was hunting. And hunters didn't announce themselves, which brought up the firepower question. American units in contact fired thousands of rounds. The sound of combat in Vietnam was distinctive, the sustained roar of M60 machine guns, the thump of M79 grenade launchers, the crack of M16s on full automatic. American doctrine emphasized volume of fire, suppression, make the enemy keep his head down while you maneuver. The Australian SAS practiced something different. Fire discipline so extreme it appeared reckless to American observers. Burst limits, aimed shots, silence between engagements. Some Australian ambushes were over before the enemy realized they were under attack. The first burst killed the point man. A second burst killed the squad leader. A third burst killed the radio operator. Precision fire into command and control elements, then vanish. The rest of the enemy column would find bodies but no attackers. No brass casings, no blood trails. Just their dead leaders and the jungle pressing in. American observers documented the techniques, photographed the training, interviewed instructors. Ben flew back to the Pentagon to write reports that gathered dust in filing cabinets. The official conclusion: Australian methods were effective for small-scale operations, but didn't scale to American needs. Translation: we're not adopting tactics that contradict our doctrine, regardless of results. The American military had invested billions developing its firepower-centric approach. Entire supply chains existed to feed the appetite for artillery shells and helicopter gunships. Defense contractors built fortunes on that appetite. Careers depended on it. Changing fundamental doctrine because some Australians got lucky in the jungle? Not happening. But individual American special operators couldn't ignore what they'd seen. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden requested permission to accompany an Australian SAS patrol in 1969. He'd been through Army Ranger School, Raider School. He'd run operations throughout the Mekong Delta. Hayden had credentials. He wasn't some boot lieutenant fresh from the States. He knew combat. I knew the jungle, or thought he did. 10 days with an Australian patrol taught him differently, taught him humility. Decades later, recording an interview, Hayden's voice would still carry the weight of that experience. They were the best I'd ever seen. The patrol was commanded by a sergeant. 6 men total, including Hayden. The mission brief was simple conduct reconnaissance deep in enemy-controlled territory. gather intelligence on NVA movements, avoid contact if possible, eliminate high-value targets if the opportunity presented. Standard special operations tasking. The execution was anything but standard. The Australian patrol was inserted by helicopter at dawn. Within 10 minutes of boots on ground, they'd vanished. Hayden had operated with Navy SEAL teams throughout. Vietnam, professionals, elite warriors. But the Australians moved through the jungle differently, slower, more deliberately, watching everything. The patrol leader made decisions that seemed inexplicable, initially halting for an hour to observe a trail intersection, bypassing perfectly good ambush positions, taking circuitous routes that added miles to their movement. But Hayden started, understanding. The Australians weren't moving through the jungle. They were reading it. Every bird call meant something. Every insect sound communicated information. The jungle was alive with signals if you knew how to interpret them. 3 days into the patrol, they still hadn't spoken a word. Not one word. Everything was hand signals. Even at night, secure in their patrol base, communication remained nonverbal. Hayden had experienced noise discipline before SEALs prided themselves on stealth. But this was different. This was a total commitment to silence. The Australians ate cold rations without unwrapping anything that crinkled. They moved their bowels off trail, buried the waste, and disguised the disturbance. They didn't smoke, didn't chew gum, didn't scratch when insects bit. They became part of the environment so completely that local wildlife resumed normal behavior within meters of their position. Birds landed on nearby branches. Monkeys fed overhead. The jungle accepted them. On day 4, the patrol found what? They'd been searching for an NVA supply trail showing recent heavy use. The patrol leader made another inexplicable decision. Instead of setting up an immediate ambush, he moved the patrol 300 meters off trail and established an observation post. For 36 hours, they watched, counted enemy troops moving past, noted their equipment, their condition, their behavior. The intelligence gathering was methodical, professional, and irrelevant to Hayden's growing concern. This was an SAS patrol. Their reputation was built on devastating ambushes that produced spectacular kill ratios. Yet they were letting hundreds of enemy soldiers pass unmolested. Hayden couldn't ask why, couldn't question the decision, couldn't even whisper a suggestion. He just had to trust the Australian sergeant knew what he was doing. Day 6. The enemy traffic pattern changed. A smaller group appeared, a dozen NVA regulars, moving with purpose rather than routine. The patrol leader watched them through binoculars for 30 seconds, then gave the signal. The patrol was displaced to an ambush position. Hayden expected them to hit the trail immediately, set up hasty firing positions like American units would. Instead, the Australians spent 2 hours preparing, selecting precise positions with interlocking fields of fire, calculating exact ranges, marking specific aiming points, establishing multiple withdrawal routes, rehearsing actions on by gesture alone. The preparation was elaborate, time-consuming, and Hayden realized absolutely necessary, because the Australians weren't planning to just hit the enemy. They were planning to annihilate them completely, then vanish without leaving evidence they'd ever existed. The NVA appeared an hour before dawn. Perfect timing. Too dark for them to see well, light enough for the Australians to aim. The enemy walked into the kill zone relaxed, talking quietly, weapons slung. They had no idea. The Australian ambush detonated with surgical precision. The first burst killed the NVA officer, leading the column 2 round center mass from the patrol leader's weapon. Simultaneous fire from 4 other positions cut down the radio operator, a point man, and 2 soldiers carrying heavy weapons. 5 men down in the first 2 seconds. The survivors scattered, trying to return fire, trying to identify where the attack originated. They died trying. The Australians shifted positions between bursts, firing from different angles, creating the impression of a much larger force. The entire engagement lasted 45 seconds. 12 NVA dead, 0 Australian casualties. Then the patrol melted back into the jungle. But they didn't extract, didn't call for helicopter pickup. Instead, they moved 500 meters and established another observation post, watching their own ambush site. Within an hour, an NVA reaction force arrived, 30 soldiers moving. Cautiously searching for their attackers, they found nothing. The Australians had policed their brass, disguised their positions, and removed any evidence. The NVA could count their dead, but couldn't determine where the fire had originated. Couldn't find blood trails or equipment left behind. Couldn't even establish how many attackers there'd been. From the NVA perspective, their comrades had been killed by ghosts, Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The psychological impact was devastating. The Australians achieved more through that single ambush than American units accomplished through days of conventional operations. Not just the body. Count though 12 confirmed kills was respectable. The intelligence gathered, the enemy demoralized, the mystique enhanced. Hayden returned from that patrol, fundamentally changed. He'd entered as a confident special operator from the most advanced military on Earth. He'd seen American technology, American firepower, and American courage overcome every obstacle. But what the Australians demonstrated wasn't about technology or firepower. It was about understanding, about patience, about becoming so intimately familiar with the environment that you gained an overwhelming advantage before the enemy even knew you existed. Hayden would later describe the experience in terms that bordered on reverence. The Australians hadn't just shown superior tactics. They'd revealed an entirely different philosophy of warfare, one that contradicted American assumptions at every level. This created a cultural problem that transcended tactics. American military identity was built on certain foundational beliefs. Americans were the best. American technology was superior. American methods, refined through victory in 2 world wars, represented the pinnacle of military science. These weren't just operational assumptions. They were articles of faith. The Australian SAS challenged all of it. Not through criticism, the Australians were unfailingly polite, professional, allied partners. They challenged it through results. Results that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Results that implied American doctrine was wrong. And implications like that don't get embraced by institutional bureaucracies. They get resisted. The resistance manifested in subtle ways initially. American after-action reports would mention Australian operations with faint praise, effective for limited objectives, suitable for small-scale engagements, suggesting the Australian approach worked only because they operated in less challenging environments, faced less capable enemies, and took fewer risks. This was provably false. The Australian tactical area of operations in Phuoc 2 included some of the most heavily infiltrated terrain in South Vietnam. The enemy the Australians faced was identical to the enemy Americans fought everywhere else. But acknowledging that meant acknowledging American methods were less effective. So the narrative became, Australian tactics were fine for Australians, but Americans needed something more robust, more professional, more suitable for real war. Green Berets arriving at Australian bases for joint operations sometimes expressed their skepticism openly. The Australian SAS carried L1A1 rifles, a heavy, full-power battle rifle the British had adapted from the Belgian FN FAL. American Special Forces carried M16s or CAR-, 15 carbines lighter, higher capacity, more modern. The Australian choice seemed antiquated. Some Green Berets mocked it. Old-fashioned rifles for old-fashioned tactics. The mockery stopped after those same Green Berets accompanied Australian patrols into the jungle and watched Australian shooters drop enemy soldiers at ranges where M16s were spraying rounds ineffectively. The L1A1 fired a 7.62 mm NATO cartridge with devastating terminal ballistics and accuracy at distance. In jungle terrain where most engagements happened under 100 meters, that rifle's power was overwhelming. But more than the hardware, it was the skill. Australian SAS troopers spent hundreds of hours on marksmanship. They knew their rifles intimately, could estimate range by eye, adjust for wind and vegetation, place shots with precision that seemed impossible to Americans used. To fire and maneuver doctrine. The cultural tension grew. Americans and Australians were supposed to be close allies, brother nations. They'd fought together in every major conflict since World War I. The relationship should have been warm, collegial. Instead, professional. Distance developed. American units would request Australian intelligence without acknowledging the source, would adopt Australian tactics without attribution, would claim credit for operations where Australian reconnaissance provided the targeting data. The Australians noticed, said nothing publicly, but the resentment accumulated. There's a particular species of jealousy that emerges between professionals. Not the crude envy of civilians, but something more corrosive. When one group achieves excellence that exposes another group's limitations, the natural human response isn't admiration, it's defensiveness. The American military in Vietnam was struggling. The strategy wasn't working. The enemy wouldn't fight conventionally, wouldn't mass for decisive battles where American firepower could annihilate them. Body counts climbed, but victory remained distant. Casualties mounted. Public support eroded. In that context, the Australian SAS represented something intolerable proof that a different approach worked better. And that proof couldn't be accepted, because accepting it meant the American way was wrong, meaning the deaths were unnecessary. The strategy that had consumed so much blood and treasure was fundamentally flawed. So instead of learning from this, Australians, American leadership minimized them, kept them at operational arm's length, praised them in official communications while ignoring their methods in practice. The Pentagon would eventually produce studies comprehensive analyses of Australian tactics, complete with recommendations for adoption by U.S. forces. Those studies circulated through the military education system for a few years, then disappeared into archives. The firepower doctrine remained. The helicopter assaults continued. The artillery preparation fires never stopped. Because changing doctrine meant admitting error, and institutional bureaucracies don't admit errors easily, especially not during a losing war with media scrutiny and congressional oversight. Individual American soldiers who worked directly with Australians came away with different opinions. The SEALs, the MACVSOG operators, the forward air controllers, who coordinated with Australian ground units. They saw the effectiveness firsthand. They respected it. Some tried to bring those lessons home, to integrate Australian techniques into American training. They mostly failed. The resistance wasn't overt. No one openly rejected proven tactics. But resources flowed to conventional programs. Promotions went to officers who embraced established doctrine. Innovation that contradicted institutional wisdom got quietly shelved. By the time the war ended, the Australian experience in Vietnam had been reduced to a footnote. Interesting historical curiosity, nothing more. The Viet Cong understood differently. In their training materials, captured. After the war, Australian units received special mention. Warnings to avoid contact. Instructions for breaking contact if Australian patrols were detected. The enemy took Australian methods seriously, because the enemy paid for underestimating them. Then VA commanders would rather face American battalion-sized operations with artillery support than Australian six-man patrols with nothing but rifles and radios. Because the Americans were predictable, loud, observable. You could hear American operations from miles away, the helicopters, the gunfire, the artillery. You could plan around them, hide when they approached, return when they left. The Australians were different. You didn't hear them coming, didn't know they were there, until your point man dropped dead and the jungle exploded with precisely aimed fire. Then they were gone, and you never found them. Ma Rung wasn't just a nickname. It was a psychological weapon more effective than any artillery barrage. The Viet Cong were tough, experienced, ideologically motivated fighters. They'd faced French paratroopers. They were fighting American Marines. Fear wasn't something they experienced often, but they feared the phantoms of the jungle, because the phantoms proved that the jungle itself could betray you, that you could move through terrain you'd controlled for years and suddenly encounter death delivered with surgical precision by men who understood the environment better than you did. The psychological impact of that fear was impossible to quantify, but strategically significant. Enemy units avoided areas where Australian patrols operated. Supply lines shifted to routes further from Australian bases. The denial of terrain was more complete than anything American firepower accomplished. The statistics tell part of the story. By the end of Australian involvement in Vietnam, the SAS had conducted over 1,200 patrols. They'd killed or captured over 1,500 enemy combatants. They'd gathered intelligence that resulted in the capture of countless weapons caches and the disruption of major enemy operations. Their casualty rate was minimal, a handful wounded, none killed in action during the period of peak operations. The kill ratios remained extraordinary, 100 to 1, 200 to 1, numbers that should have revolutionized Western military thought. Instead, they became uncomfortable data points that didn't fit preferred narratives. American casualties in Vietnam exceeded 58,000 dead. Australian casualties were 521. The American military was 40 times larger. But the casualty ratio wasn't proportional to force size. It reflected different approaches, different doctrines, different understanding of what jungle warfare required. The Americans tried to impose their will on Vietnam. The Australians tried to understand it. One approach led to industrial scale, casualties and strategic stalemate. The other led to tactical dominance and minimal losses. But acknowledging that comparison required confronting uncomfortable truths about American exceptionalism, military doctrine, and institutional pride. The rivalry between U.S. and Australian special forces wasn't documented in official histories. No dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches or refused orders. Just quiet professional distance, politeness masking resentment. Americans uncomfortable with excellence they couldn't match. Australians bemused by allies who rejected lessons learned in blood. Both sides remained professional because the alliance demanded it. But the friendship, the genuine respect and camaraderie that should exist between warriors fighting the same enemy never fully developed. Because one side was winning using methods, the other side refused to adopt. There's a photograph taken in 1970 at Nui Dat. American and Australian Special Forces operators standing together, weapons slung, looking at the camera. Professional soldiers in jungle fatigues, sun-faded gear, faces showing the strain of two. Many patrols. They look like brothers, allies, friends. But if you study the image closely, you notice the spacing. Body language. Americans grouped together. Australians grouped together. Small distance between the groups. Physical gap reflecting psychological reality. We're on the same side, the photograph says. We're not enemies. But we're not friends either. Because friendship requires respect. And respect requires acknowledging excellence. And acknowledging Australian excellence meant confronting American failure. So the gap remained. The patrol moved through a jungle so dense that visibility extended less than 10 meters. 5 men moving in single file, spacing irregular to prevent. Patterning, each man responsible for a sector of observation. The point man was Australian SAS, 31 years old, 3 tours in Vietnam, veteran of the Malayan emergency before that. He'd spent more time in jungle terrain than most men spent in office buildings. Behind him, 2 American Green Berets. Weapons at ready, alert, but uncomfortable. They were good soldiers, well-trained, experienced, motivated. But moving through this environment required skills their training hadn't emphasized. Behind the Americans, 2 more Australians. The patrol. Leader and the tail end Charlie, ensuring security front and rear. This was supposed to be a joint operation. Cross-training, building cooperation between allied special forces. The reality was more complicated. The Americans were observing, learning, trying to understand what made Australian operations so effective. The Australians were teaching without condescending, demonstrating rather than lecturing, professional courtesy maintained throughout. But the tension was there, unspoken. The Americans, knowing their doctrine, didn't produce these results. The Australians knew the Americans wouldn't change their doctrine regardless. The patrol had been out for 6 days. Total silence maintained except for necessary radio communications with headquarters. Hand signals for everything else. The Americans struggled with this. Their training emphasized verbal communication, quick commands, constant updates. The Australian insistence on total silence felt excessive, paranoid even, until day 3 when the point man froze. No signal, no gesture, just absolute stillness. The entire patrol stopped, waited, listened. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then the Australian point man slowly raised his hand enemy ahead. The patrol melted off the trail into defensive positions. I waited another 10 minutes. Then heard them NVA patrol, 15 men moving perpendicular to their position, close enough to hear their equipment rattling, close enough to smell their cigarette smoke, but not close enough to see the Australian patrol, invisible in the undergrowth, absolutely motionless, barely breathing. The enemy passed, completely, unaware they'd come within 30 meters of annihilation. The Australian patrol leader made the decision not to engage. Not worth compromising their mission for 15 enemies who'd escaped. The Americans were confused. Initially 15 easy kills walked away. But the patrol leader explained later, after they'd extracted, why he'd held fire. The mission was reconnaissance. Engaging would have revealed their presence, triggered enemy search operations, and compromised future patrols. The 15 enemy soldiers weren't high-value targets, weren't worth the cost. The Australian approach was patient, strategic, thinking 3 moves ahead. The American approach was opportunistic, enemy in sight, enemy engaged. Different philosophies produced different results. That patrol ended without contact. No shots fired, no enemies killed. The Americans considered it uneventful. The Australians considered it successful. They'd gathered intelligence on enemy movement. Patterns, mapped trail networks, identified supply routes. Information that would enable future operations. The Americans wanted action. The Australians wanted understanding. Both approaches were valid for their respective doctrines. But only one doctrine was keeping soldiers alive at extraordinary rates. The American soldiers who participated in those joint operations returned to their units with mixed feelings. They'd seen something remarkable. Techniques that worked. Results that spoke for themselves. But they'd also internalized that their own approach, the American way they'd been trained in, believed in, staked their professional identity on wasn't optimal. That's a hard thing for a warrior to accept. That your entire career has been built on methods less effective than what a smaller ally developed through hard experience in forgotten wars. Some soldiers embraced the lesson, tried to incorporate Australian techniques into their personal operating procedures. Most couldn't. The institutional momentum was too strong. The doctrine is too entrenched. You don't change military bureaucracies, one enlightened soldier at a time. By 1971, Australian forces began withdrawing from Vietnam. The political calculus had shifted. Public support for the war had evaporated in Australia, just as it had in America. The government decided further commitment wasn't justified. The Australian SAS left having achieved the highest kill ratio of any unit in the conflict, having earned the respect of the enemy, if not the full acknowledgement of their allies. They took their lessons home, refined them, and incorporated them into future operations. The Vietnam experience shaped Australian Special Forces doctrine for the next 50 years, made them one of the most respected special operations communities in the world. But during the war itself, during the years when those lessons could have saved American lives, they remained largely unheeded. The American military eventually learned from Vietnam. But the learning was slow, painful, filtered through institutional resistance. It took decades before U.S. Special Operations fully embraced some of the principles the Australians had demonstrated. Patience over firepower in certain contexts. Intelligence over attrition. Cultural understanding over technological superiority. The transformation of American special operations from direct action teams to strategic intelligence assets reflected lessons the Australians could have taught in 1967. Instead, Americans had to learn them independently, at greater cost, over a longer time. Pride is expensive, especially when it prevents you from accepting hard truths from uncomfortable sources. There's an epilogue to this story that matters. In 2001, when the United States launched operations in Afghanistan, Australian Special Forces deployed alongside Americans. The terrain was different mountains instead of jungle, but the principles remained. The Australians operated with small teams, emphasizing intelligence gathering, building local relationships, achieving objectives through patience and precision rather than overwhelming force. The Americans had evolved by then. Special operations had become more sophisticated, more nuanced. The doctrinal gap had narrowed. Both countries had learned from failures and successes. The professional respect that had been absent in Vietnam finally emerged. American and Australian operators worked together effectively, genuinely collaboratively, without the underlying tension that had poisoned the relationship 40 years earlier. But it took 40 years. 4 decades of separate experiences, separate wars, separate lessons. The brotherhood that should have been forged in Vietnam emerged eventually, just not when it would have mattered most. The symbolic object at best represents this story isn't a weapon. It isn't a piece of technology. It's silent. The Australian commitment to noise-disciplined 10-day patrols without a spoken word, communication entirely by hand signal, movement so careful that jungle wildlife ignored them. That silence represented a philosophy. Humility before the environment. Respect for the enemy. Understanding that the jungle would teach you if you listened, kill you if you didn't. The Americans brought noise. Helicopters and artillery and radio chatter. Announcing their presence, imposing their will, demanding the environment conform to their methods. One approach was loud because it could afford to be. The other was silent because it had to be. The silence wasn't a weakness. It was strength. refined through hard experience into practical doctrine. And silence carries meaning beyond tactics. The silence between American and Australian special forces, the words not spoken, the lessons not shared, the respect is not acknowledged. That silence echoed through the years, symbolic of opportunities lost and pride preserved. Wars aren't just fought between enemies. Sometimes they're fought between allies who can't reconcile different visions of excellence. Those wars don't produce casualties in the conventional sense. They produce quiet resentment, professional distance, missed opportunities. The Americans and Australians never became enemies. But they weren't friends either. The title of this story, We Are Not Friends, captures that reality better than any official history. Because being allies doesn't mean being friends. Being partners doesn't mean being equals. The American-Australian relationship in Vietnam was professional, polite, functional, and ultimately limited by American unwillingness to acknowledge Australian superiority in jungle warfare. That unwillingness cost lives, American lives. How? Many exactly? Impossible to calculate. But consider if American Special Operations had adopted Australian tactics in 1967, how many reconnaissance patrols would have survived that didn't? How many ambushes would have succeeded that failed? How many soldiers would have come home that didn't? The question can't be answered with precision, but the implication is clear. Institutional pride has a body count the Viet Cong understood, something the American military struggled to accept. They understood that Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, represented a level of operational excellence they couldn't counter. The enemy gave the Australians respect that came from fear. Fear born of repeated encounters where the Viet Cong thought they controlled terrain and discovered they were being hunted. The Americans wanted that same fear, that same respect, tried to earn it through firepower and technology. Never quite achieved it, because fear of that magnitude doesn't come from what you bring to the fight. It comes from how completely you master the environment. The Australians mastered the jungle. The Americans tried to destroy it. One approach created phantoms. The other created targets. There's a final truth this story reveals about freedom and ideology. The Americans came to Vietnam carrying the weight of democratic responsibility, believing their cause was just, their methods righteous, their victory inevitable. The burden of that belief was immense. It demanded results, demanded proof that American methods worked, demanded validation of American exceptionalism. The Australians came with different baggage. They'd learned humility in Malaya, where victory came slowly through techniques that contradicted conventional wisdom. They didn't need to prove their approach was best. They just needed it to work. That freedom from ideological burden, that willingness to adopt whatever methods kept soldiers alive regardless of how they reflected on national pride gave them an operational advantage Americans couldn't match. Democracy is a heavy thing to carry into combat. The weight of representing something larger than yourself. The pressure to demonstrate that your nation's way is superior. The inability to admit error because error suggests weakness. The Australian SAS could afford to be pragmatic because they weren't carrying democracy's standard into battle. They were just soldiers doing a job, trying to survive. The Americans couldn't be just soldiers. They had to be ambassadors, symbols, representatives of the most powerful nation on earth. That symbolism constrained them, limited their flexibility, made them rigid when they needed to be adaptive. The lesson, if there is one, isn't about tactics. Tactics change with terrain and technology. The lesson is about humility, about acknowledging excellence wherever it exists, about putting mission accomplishment above institutional pride. The American military eventually learned that lesson, but the learning came late, at terrible cost, after decades of institutional resistance. In Vietnam, when the lesson was available from allies who'd already paid the price for every principle they taught, American pride prevented acceptance. And soldiers died because of it. Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The name echoes, still in military circles. A reminder that sometimes the most effective warriors aren't the ones with the most resources. They're the ones with the most humility, the ones willing to let the environment teach them, the ones who understand that silence carries more weight than firepower, that patience achieves more than aggression, that excellence doesn't require validation from others. The Australian SAS in Vietnam demonstrated all of that. The Americans watched, documented, and largely ignored it, because acknowledging Australian excellence meant confronting American failure. And that acknowledgement required a different kind of courage than facing enemy fire. The rivalry between American and Australian special forces wasn't a rivalry of enemies. It was a rivalry of professionals. One group achieved results that exposed the other group's limitations. One group operating under doctrinal constraints that prevented adopting proven methods. The rivalry was quiet, professional, unacknowledged in official records, but it was real. And it mattered. Because in the spaces between allies, in the gaps, where respect should exist but doesn't, in the silence that represents words not spoken and lessons not learned, that's where wars are lost. Not to the enemy, to pride, to institutional inertia, to the human inability to admit when someone else has found a better way. The jungle is gone now. The war is history. The soldiers who fought it are aging or dead. But the lesson remains. When warriors achieve extraordinary results using methods that contradict your doctrine, you have two choices: learn from them or dismiss them. The Americans mostly dismissed them. And that dismissal echoes through military history as a reminder that the hardest enemy to defeat isn't across the battlefield. It's the one staring back from the mirror, the one who can't accept that someone else might have a better answer, the one who values pride over progress, doctrine over results, institutional face over tactical effectiveness. We are not friends. We're allies, partners, brothers in arms. But friendship requires honesty, requires acknowledging when your partner excels beyond you, requires learning from them instead of resenting them. That friendship never fully developed in Vietnam. The potential was there. American and Australian special forces fighting the same enemy in the same jungle should have been natural allies, should have shared knowledge freely, learned from each other, emerged stronger together. Instead, they operated in parallel, professional but distant, polite but separated. The tragedy isn't that they fought poorly. Both were exceptional combat units. The tragedy is what could have been achieved if American pride hadn't prevented American learning. The Australian SAS returned home to minimal fanfare. Small unit, small country, limited political importance. Their extraordinary achievement in Vietnam received modest recognition at the time, greater appreciation later. But during the war, when their methods could have influenced American operations, they remained an interesting curiosity rather than a model to emulate. The Americans continued with firepower doctrine, continued taking casualties, continued fighting a war they couldn't win using methods that couldn't adapt. And somewhere in the jungle, the ghosts of what might have been the American soldiers who died using tactics proven inferior to methods their Australian allies had offered, those ghosts whisper still, reminding us that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the rifle. It's the one with the ego,